called Reclamation, a culture policy for Arab-Israeli partnership. And as you'll see in this lecture, Joseph is really doing vital work in understanding and promoting possibilities of future cooperation in the region. So this is a very important lecture and guest, and I think also touches on different aspects of Jewish identity and Arab identity currently. So welcome, Joseph.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles. Thank you, Charles, and thank you all for your interest in this topic. I would like to begin today by, alas, troubling you with 8 seconds of the kind of images on Arabic television that are probably familiar to all of you.
هم اليهود يكشرون عن أنيابهم كلما سنحت لهم الفرصة.
Obviously, these sorts of trends in Arabic discourse are being parsed in a scholarly way, including by any number of speakers at this conference. But our point of departure at the moment is an operational question. Is it possible to roll back anti-Semitism in Arabic discourse? That is, through Arab media, Arab mosques, Arab schools, and political discussions. My answer is yes, from a certain set of personal experiences that I've been asked to talk about today in the form of a sort of field report of ongoing efforts to challenge anti-Semitism in Arab countries. And to give you a little bit of a flavor of what I'm talking about, here is a moment from another television program, an interview on a primetime television discussion on the Pan-Arab television network Al-Arabiya to 90 million people, which I did about 8 years ago.
ذكرت في كتابك أن جدك حاخام وأنه كان حاخاما جدك لأمك في بغداد.
جد أمي كان حاخام. كان أولا ما يسمى باللغة العبرية حرف بيت الدين، يعني المسؤول عن المحكمة اليهودية المكلفة بالأحوال الاجتماعية حق الجالية اليهودية. وبعدين صار بالثلاثينات، بمطلع الثلاثينات، حاخام باشي، وهو مصطلح تركي يعني الحاخام الرئيسي ببغداد ومدن عراقية أخرى.
ثم بعد ذلك انتقل من بغداد ولا كانت الهجرة من بغداد في عهد والدتك في جيل والدتك؟
وولدتي بنت عمرها 5 سنوات هاجرت مع العيلة سنة 51.
لماذا هاجروا؟
هاجروا بكثرة، يعني أغلب العراقيين اليهود هاجروا بهذه الفترة بعد الحرب، اندلاع الحرب في إسرائيل وفلسطين سنة 48. قبل ذلك حتى من سنة 41 صار الوضع العراقيين اليهود صعب جدا، صار في مأساة. كان في الفرهود المشهور قتل فيه مئات اليهود، وبعض المسلمين دافعوا عنهم في ذاك اليوم الأسود. فأخذ اليهود يشعرون بأنه لا مستقبل لهم في العراق مع الأسف، وهاجروا. أنا أتمنى أن تعود يعني روح التسامح والأخوة اللي كانت عبر الأجيال والقرون، ولكن ذلك الفترة كانت صعبة.
بتغني لنا قبل ما ننهي البرنامج؟
أوكي. أغنية بالإسبانية اليهودية لدينو. Cuando el rey Nimrod al campo salía, miraba en el cielo y en la estrella, vida luz santa en la judería, que había de nacer Abraham Avinu.
هذه بأي لغة؟ بالإسبانية؟
بالإسبانية وفي بعض المصطلحات العبرية فيها. As some of you may know, one of the more charming conceits of Arabic TV talk shows is that the speaker, be he a cleric or a politician,
is often asked to recite a line or two of poetry or a song, and uses it as an opportunity to punctuate whatever points he's trying to make during the rest of the show. And obviously in that way there is some relationship between the song and the rest of the chat. And it reflects more than my own desire to share this history with a mass audience, but also plainly the host's willingness to help me do that, and to engage in a friendly discussion that serves to humanize a community that most Arab viewers have never seen except for soldiers brandishing a rifle and so on. And so in that respect, a broadcast like that is in a sense an antidote to the kind of material that is so familiar to all of you. And to the question, is it possible to roll back anti-Semitism in Arabic discourse? I argue, for reasons that you will be exposed to momentarily, that the answer is yes. And it stems from three types of opportunities that didn't exist a generation ago. And they might be referred to as top-down, bottom-up, and outside-in. Top-down, in this context, means that in the well-known alignment that has emerged with Iran, Islamists and jihadists on the one hand, and Israel and certain Sunni Arab powers on the other, there is a sense that Israel is now in a de facto camp on security issues and perhaps to some extent economic ones as well. And so that creates perhaps a new opportunity to provide a measure of political cover for these arrangements by encouraging a new discussion about Jews and Israel among Arab publics. By bottom up, I'm referring to a rising grassroots trend, particularly among Arab youth, increasingly exposed to the culture of the global village, who, as part of a larger kind of a rebellion against the education systems they were reared in, feel that much of what they were taught about Judaism, the Jewish people, Israel, and so on, was untrue. They're more curious than ever before to learn more, and they are open and even keen to engage Israelis and Jews generally. So the possibility of encouraging that trend, empowering those young people, strengthening their hand, is another important opportunity. And finally, what I'm calling outside in refers to the fact that diaspora Jewish and Israeli elements of various sorts, some government, some outside government, are developing their own capacities to engage Arab publics in the Arabic language. And you'll be seeing some examples there. And that is a further form of mass communication that is potentially helpful in this regard. And between the top-down, the bottom-up, and the outside-in, there is now a sense of momentum in the Arab infosphere, whereby these different trends are in different ways reinforcing each other. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that for each one of these, there's also a kind of a counter-trend, beginning on the top-down side. The same sense of Arab embattlement with respect to Iran, Shiite Islamists, and so on, is also encouraging another kind of discourse in which anti-Semitism features prominently. And to sort of illustrate that, I'm going to show you a clip from another television channel, also run by Saudis, called Wisal, which has its own way of encouraging people in the region to want to fight Iran.
يا عرب بغداد واصحوا، هل بكم رجل حكيم التشيع بذرة الكافر ابن سبع اليهودي قد دفنها برد فارس انتقاما من جدودي كبرت وقامت تسلك خبثة تتعدى الحدودي من كلامكم ثمرها عاش في حزب الرجيم وكيف يعطى الخمس للحاخام لاعتل زريم يا عرب إيران تطعن طعن أعراض محمد لو بكم رجل غيور الدم بعروقه تجمد انهضوا والشرك ساير والله إلا أن يخمد موعد لله ما يخلف على بيض الرقيم يا عرب إيران تبغى منكم حقد الوثار يا عرب إيران تبغى تبدل الإسلام نار يا عرب إيران تبغى داركم دار البوار شوفوا القتل المنظم في شوارعكم ظليم يا عرب بغداد صارت فارسية يا نيام شوفوا السيستاني ما يفقه عروبي الكلام.
So quite obviously, this represents a kind of a mutation of anti-Semitism, if you will, in the sense that, that the channel's desire to use every trick in the book to malign Shiites and Iran leads them quite naturally to employ anti-Semitism, feeding on the generations of brainwashing against Jews that are so strongly that is so strongly felt in the region. I'm pleased to tell you that in 2014, the government of Saudi Arabia banned the TV channel Wisal. They evicted the studio and the broadcasters because the channel, through its programming, had incited a massacre in a Yemeni hospital, a massacre in 2 Shiite mosques in Saudi Arabia, a massacre of Shiites in Kuwait, and other acts of violence directly incited by the channel. Unfortunately, when a well-intentioned member of the Majlis Shura in Saudi Arabia, the Consultative Council, apparently out of an effort to encourage the kingdom to close down more such channels, tried to create an opinion poll on Twitter. He asked, in light of the fact that the Wisal channel incites sectarian violence and serves a factional agenda that sometimes is in tune with that of ISIS, do you support its having been closed? Just about 25,000 people responded to the poll on Twitter. 18% of them said, yes, we support the channel having been closed. 82% said no, they were opposed to the closure of the channel. So 18% is not a small number of people in a country of tens of millions, but 82% is surely a very large number of people. And that speaks to the fact that that rising trend, that encouraging trend I pointed to, remains a minority trend and is quite clearly embattled and intimidated by those who oppose it. Now, in addition to that problem, I mentioned the hope of outside-in engagement by Jews and Israelis through Arabic communications into Arab countries. It is at a very junior stage. There are attempts by, for example, American Jews to travel directly to the region and meet with heads of state. Here is Rabbi Mark Schneer, a kind of a maverick in the Jewish community, who has made the rounds of the Gulf and met with most Arab kings, as well as princes and presidents beyond the Gulf, and is widely covered in Israeli and American media, bringing the good tidings that he's met the king of Bahrain and so on. He's a wonderful guy. He loves Jews. He wants peace, etc. Alas, that message is not delivered to the Bahraini public through Bahrain's establishment media. They and Saudis and Emiratis and others who engaged Rabbi Schneier and others from the Jewish community tend to not cover Jewish visits at all, And the coverage of the visits comes from opponents of these governments. So for example, here's coverage of this very visit on the Iraqi channel Al-Ahd, which has a massive audience across the Gulf.
هذه المنظمة الإرهابية تلقى أعضاؤها في العام الماضي دعوة من حاكم البحرين حمد الخليفة لإحياء ما يسمى بعيد الحانوكة في المنامة، حيث رقصوا على أنغام أغنية يهودية تدعو إلى هدم المسجد الأقصى وبناء الهيكل المسؤول.
Oh, wow. Right? So what happens is then that whatever progress is made in high-level contacts between certain Jewish figures and heads of state in Arab countries, I don't mean to diminish that at all. I hope that it's working out very well. That is, not only is it not translating into a positive impact on the public discussion, it may even trigger a backlash. And often the Jewish groups are not even aware of the backlash, let alone in a position to respond to it in Arabic. So there's a kind of a game of pin the tail on the donkey going on here. So these are serious challenges to any prospect of positive change in top-down, bottom-up, or outside-in strategies. So as Charles mentioned, I wrote a book after working on these issues in the region for about 20 years to lay out the opportunities and the pitfalls and present a strategy to navigate them. In walking you through it with a few examples, I'd like to begin by laying out an agenda. Because we all have a general sense that anti-Semitism in the region needs to be challenged and rolled back. But what exactly does that mean? What are its component parts, and what would it look like thematically? So I argue that there are 7 key points, and if you'll bear with me, I will share them and read them aloud. First, quite obviously, end institutionalized demonization. Cease the vilification of Israel and Jews generally through Arab establishment outlets and Iranian and jihadist information operations. Second, revive local historical memory. That is, grant Arab publics knowledge long denied them of indigenous Jewish history, Jews' contributions to the region, their dispossession and forced flight, and their living legacy in Israel, through exposure to Jews' broader historical experience, contextualize concerns about security in the face of anti-Semitism. Number 3, repair spiritual bonds. Restore awareness of the connection among Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Rekindle affinity for the Jewish faith by highlighting a commonality of texts, rituals, and values. Number 4, elucidate Israel. Provide a duly corrective, multi-layered representation of the Jewish state, its history, its people, and their natural place in regional affairs. Desegregate the public discussion. That is, in an environment where Israelis have long been denied a platform, ensure the regular participation of Israelis not as foils, but as contributors in media conversations about politics and defense, education and development, health and fitness, science and technology, arts and ideas, and the range of human aspirations shared by all the region's peoples. Catalyze civil partnership. Expose Arab audiences and learners to the benefits of joint effort with Israelis and other Jews in a range of civil sectors. Draw attention to specific opportunities for cooperation. Spotlight positive outcomes as new partnerships develop. Promote Arab-Israeli friendship as a value. Foster civil communication and exchange. And finally, last but not least, expose rejectionism. narrate and commemorate the century of damage wrought by pan-Arabist and Islamist forces through their use of anti-Semitism as a political tool. Enlist this history in exposing the rhetoric and tactics of rejectionist forces today. That agenda, in my view, if pursued successfully on a massive scale, would not change the situation overnight, but over a generation's time, from my perspective, the blink of an eye, would have the potential to make a serious dent in the public discussion and promote the conditions that would enable a peace between peoples. And again, it lies in these three facets. What would it look like to take advantage of the top-down opportunity? It means that those Western countries, for example, that are allied with Arab governments would begin to have a more serious discussion about the content of their communications platforms and leverage goodwill, incentives, and yes, where necessary, apply pressure in order to see an overhaul of the content of these outlets and not merely talk about this idea vaguely, but rather provide a turnkey solution. That is, instead of simply saying, as so many have, you guys need to do something about incitement on your media, actually build a team of trainers, bilingual, bicultural trainers and specialists who would be mandated to enter these institutions over a sustained period of time, train and mentor the talent that runs them, and institute monitoring and accountability to ensure that whatever commitments the leaders make are met. Structure this in a way that is, in some sense, marked by benchmarks so that there is an exchange and an understanding of mutual benefit, provided that the stipulated goals are met. Bottom up means seeking out, engaging, befriending, strengthening, and empowering those grassroots actors who are not waiting for Arab governments to lead the way in promoting a new discussion about Israel and Jews. And outside in means end the problem I showed you a moment ago, where Jewish community organizations, leaders, and so on are unable to follow or respond to the torrent of anti-Semitism that their visits often trigger. I submit to you that all three of these pursuits are possible. With respect to the top-down, the broadcast I showed you of my own appearance on Al Arabiya is by no means unique. There are publications and other broadcasts controlled by various Arab powers in which some actors want to promote a new set of ideas about Israel and Jews. Here's one of them, a place I write for, Al-Majalla, Saudi Arabia's flagship news magazine. This story is about an Egyptian Jew who built half of Alexandria. The lead is ask a young Egyptian what Smuha means, and he will likely tell you it is an excellent football team in Alexandria, lately ranking third in Egypt's Premier League. He may also know that the team takes its name from Smuha City, a resplendent Alexandrian suburb. So it wasn't surprising that when Richard Smuha, a Swiss national, recently submitted his passport to a man of Egyptian origin at an airport in Amsterdam, the officer asked him, "Did you know that your family was named after a place in Egypt?" But Smuha's reply surprised the officer. Actually, the place in Egypt was named after my family. The story proceeds to relate how Richard Smuha, an Iraqi Jew, moved to Alexandria in the 1920s, bought a large bit of swampland that was blocking the natural expansion of the municipality, drained it, and converted it to a British-style garden city. It became an affluent place with churches, synagogues, mosques, and cultural centers, and a large residence. And enabled Alexandria to expand substantially. He ran it for 30 years and then had it all taken away by Gamal Abdel Nasser during the period of sequestration and dispossession. It was an opportunity to tell this story to an audience that scarcely knows there even were Jews in Egypt, let alone that there were close to 1 million Jews in the space between Casablanca and Kuwait City on the eve of the Second World War, and they were dispossessed and forced to flee en masse. So I submit to you that given a spread of publications and broadcasts in which well-intentioned people do exist, if you match that with political capital brought via exchanges with Arab allies, you give them more space and more of a mandate to do much more of this type of work. With respect to the bottom-up, I think you gained a sense of how embattled these voices are, even as their numbers grow. And so I will only speak in general terms and say that nascent efforts and strategies are being developed as we speak to strengthen the hand of these figures, protect them, and connect them with one another and with friends all over the world. As I say, I'm not going to go into detail about that right now. But I will tell you about the issue of what it might look like to strengthen Jewish and Israeli capacities to engage Arab audiences in Arabic. I was given an opportunity by a small Jewish organization in San Francisco called JEMENA. It stands for Jews Indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa, to build an Arabic program for the group. It's an organization that since about 2001 has been concerned with educating Americans and other Westerners who also don't know much about the Middle Eastern Jewish historical narrative, that Judaism isn't just lox and bagels and other Ashkenazi trappings, but it is a multifaceted, diverse history that spans the world, including what is today the Arabic-speaking world. So what we did is to build a multimedia platform with a dynamic website, articles, a wonderful woman who manages our correspondence on social media through 5 hours a day of very active correspondence. And it has won a following in the millions. And there is a kind of negotiation with an Arab audience that is different from the traditional negotiation of diplomats among one another. And it is an emotional negotiation. And using the JEMENA platform, we have attempted to begin that process. And so I'll share with you a specimen of that effort and then tell you a little bit more about what went into it and what we did with it.
اسم القداسة على اسم جدي داود الكويتي. أخو داود صالح الكويتي.
الأخوان صالح وداود الكويتي هما يهوديان عراقيان ولدا في منطقة الشرق لدولة الكويت، وكانا من أهم الموسيقيين في العراق خلال ثلاثينات وأربعينات القرن الماضي. وقاما بتطوير المقامات العراقية وتقديم ألحان لكل مطربي تلك الفترة. وشكل الأخوان النواة الأولى لشكل الموسيقى العراقية التي تربت أجيال مختلفة على أصالتها وأنغامها.
ولابس الوردي والما يغنوا لها غنيت أنا بوحدي.
هو الأغنية العراقية. هو الأغنية العراقية. لون الأغنية العراقية الأربعينية والخمسينية والخمسينية.
هنا في إسرائيل الكويتي يجدد المغني الشاب دودو تاسا يرثو إبداعات أجداده من الطرب الأصيل لأجيال معاصرة وقادمة. عندما يغني دودو حول العالم تسأله الجماهير المحبة متى ستغني في الكويت والعراق؟ متى ستزور موطن أجدادك وتذكر الأجيال الجديدة بالأخوين داوود وصالح الكويتي؟ وجواب دودو لهم هو:
أشكركم يا إخواني في الكويت والعراق على دعمكم للموسيقى مالتي ومال أجدادي، والله هذا أكبر حلم. أتمنى أجي لكم ونغني سوا مثل أيام زمان الحلوة. ممكن تساعدوني نحول أنا الحلم إلى حقيقة. تخيلوا المنظر.
أعزائي المشاهدين، دعونا نستمد الإلهام من ماضي الزمن الجميل لرسم مسار أكثر إشراقاً للمستقبل.
So, to give this a little bit of context, the word normalization is often used to describe the process we're talking about. I don't like the word because it presumes that that relations between Arabs and Jews, Arabs and Israelis are not normal, and it's like the creation of a forced normal. But indeed, what is more normal than a young man who loves to sing and comes from a family of singers, learning the language of his ancestors and wanting to reconnect in person and on stage with the country of his ancestors? And who will stand in the way of that, claiming that such a desire is in any way inauthentic or inappropriate? It is simply an inherent human right. And the thing about taking a step in a new kind of journey that might be a little controversial or scary at first is that when you do move forward, you find that there are people along the way who come out of every place you could imagine and say, we want to help. So we brought this video to a gentleman named Alberto Fernandez, who heads Al-Hurra, the pan-Arab television channel controlled by the United States. We said, Alberto, would you be willing to air this clip on your channel? And he said, Joseph, not only am I going to, let me tell you something, this kind of work is exactly why our channel was set up. This is what we're meant to do, and not only will we air your little clip, but we're going to create an hour of television built around the story of Dudu Tassa, and we're going to air it over and over again. And that included the opportunity for me to sort of accentuate the implications of the video you just saw in a little clip as well.
أنا نفسي من أحفاد جيل المهجرين من اليهود العراقيين، ونحن نفرح عندما نسمع عن عراقيين في الداخل يهتموا فينا، يهتموا في إعادة بناء الجسور معنا. عسى أن نتعاون على جميع المجالات ويكون هناك إعادة بناء الفسيفساء العراقية التي كانت القوة العراقية دائما نبعت من التنوع.
Earlier in this little presentation, you saw a rather unpleasant opinion poll. We did our own opinion poll after the Al-Hurra broadcasts and our own social media activity on the story of Dudu's dream. We asked our audience, do you support Dudu Tassa's right to perform in the lands of his ancestors? The response was 71% in favor and 29% against. We know that such an outcome would have been unimaginable a generation ago, particularly in light of the fact that Facebook is an application where if you want to participate in an opinion poll, you have to, you expose the audience to your name and photograph and so on. So everyone on that 71% who voted in favor of Dudu performing in Iraq and Kuwait, one can identify who they are and where they live and so on. And so we consider that a real step forward. And furthermore, our friends, the more active friends on social media, now numbering over 60,000 for Jemena, include people who are taking this message on their own, in their own hands, into their own communities. So for example, a Libyan professor of literature approached us and asked, he lives in Tripoli, do you know of any Jewish Libyan poets? And we reached out in the community and indeed discovered there was someone named Bouhleyqa who wrote a lot of poetry that was well liked in the early 20th century and then fled after the massacres of 1967. We got a hold of the stuff, we sent it to this gentleman, and he proceeded to teach it in his poetry class. There was a young Algerian who has been sort of consuming the content we produce every day for quite some time. And one Friday, when he went to his mosque in Algiers, a preacher delivered a predictably stem-winding, blood-curdling sermon about Jews. And he stood up and confronted him with some of the things he had learned on the Jemena site. Preacher was very angry, and there was an altercation, and police were called in. But it speaks to the fact that people get fired up and they speak out. And so the more of this you do, the more of an impact you have. And one of the things we're especially proud of is the fact that, perhaps motivated by our content and the videos we have created, some of our followers are creating their own videos and sending them to us. Here is an example. It was created by a young Tunisian who knew that a Tunisian Jewish woman who had fled 40 years ago was coming back to visit her village in the southern part of the country and was going to look for old friends whom she had left behind, predominantly Muslim ones, of course. And here is the moment when she found a very close friend from her childhood. I think that the video in its own way kind of says it all. It did go viral. Millions of people have seen it. It's been written up in Tunisian publications and beyond, in Algeria, Morocco, and so on. Who will stand in the way of these two women reuniting? Who will justify their forced separation for 4 decades? These questions have obvious answers, and if you are serious, systematic, and methodical about presenting the truth to a mass audience, we believe that smart people, who are the majority of people in every Arab country, will find their way. So that is pretty much what I was asked to share with you today. Thanks again for your interest, and if anyone has any questions, I'd be delighted to respond.
Hi, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all this. It's really amazing. Could you tell us, please, I don't know if other people know, but I'm very curious in the history of Jemena and a little bit more about the organization.
Well, obviously the issue of Middle Eastern and North African Jewish history is one that is, before we even get into the Arab world, where it was written out of the history books already a couple of generations ago, is not well known in the West. So Jimena was created first for the purpose of educating Americans and then Europeans about the fact that there was this history, and it was a magnificent one that came to a tragic end. At that time, 2001, even 2007, 10, the Arab world wasn't on the map as a potential area of focus. But they discovered spontaneously that Arab students in universities in the US were keenly interested in this, and there was a kind of pent-up demand. And so a decision was reached to begin to approach Arab audiences from their perspective, to speak to them in what is a different milieu than the US and the West, and speaking to a mindset that has been marinated in anti-Semitism is a different exercise than communicating with an audience in the US that, for the most part, was not. So that is the add-on to the Jimena program in the Arabic language, and we continue to work on it.
Yes, thank you very much. Earlier discussion has touched on what one might call a certain self-criticism deficit in Arab culture. And I was wondering whether you felt that that was something that should be sort of raised head on or should be handled indirectly. And I'd like to ask you specifically about one incident that would call for self-criticism, and that is at the beginning of the Second Intifada, there was this blood libel that the IDF deliberately killed Mohammed Abdullah in the arms of his fathers. And when Fowles wrote his article about this in The Atlantic in 2003, it was pretty clear to him and to everybody else who looked at the evidence that the footage had been staged. But one of the things he said is, you'll never get the Arab world to acknowledge this. It's just not in the cards. And I'm wondering whether A, you think that time can come, and B, whether a campaign to address that and to say, look, this was stuff that was staged by people who wanted war and brought disaster not only on Israel, but brought disaster on the Arab world, might be an argument that some of the audience you want to reach would be receptive to.
So first of all, to answer your penultimate question directly, yes, I know that moment can come and believe that it will come. In another sort of presentation that I also do, we discuss the issue of critical thinking and the fact that critical thinking skills have been denied students in Arab schools across the region for generations. Critical thinking and introspection are intrinsically related, and the example you raised of a blood libel is the opposite. It's demagoguery. It's the common practice of dictatorship. And dictatorship abhors critical thinking, abhors granting a population the tools to reason their way to a better world and a better society, including identifying personal weaknesses, communal weaknesses, etc., and finding ways to address them, which are essential to everyone. And so you can actually see some of the material that I share both in video online and in my third book about Arabic media that points to a rising trend in the encouragement of critical thinking. And indeed, critical thinking and the challenging of anti-Semitism are twin virtues in the face of a single pathology. They are inherently related. They are partners in the degradation of Arab intellectual culture by demagogues going back 70 years. And those who promote critical thinking and those who abhor anti-Semitism within the region are natural allies. And it is I would say, a corollary of my point about bottom-up activity, promoting reformist grassroots voices that finding ways to identify, engage, and empower these actors is a crucial part of the challenge.
Sorry. Okay, my question's pretty quick. First of all, thank you so much for your really engaging and multimedia and well-organized presentation. It was great to follow. My question was about number 3, which was repair spiritual bonds. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more about that and what are other resources that you know of for doing that, or examples.
Sure, well, of course, obviously Judaism is the spiritual antecedent of Christianity and Islam. There's considerable writing and scholarship and efforts predominantly in the English language to appeal by one faith on behalf of, to two faiths on behalf of the other in all combinations to recognize the enormous commonality. The problem is that very little of this material has been made available in Arabic. And the challenge of doing so is more than a matter of translation. It's a matter of reinterpretation. It's a matter of speaking to an audience not where you want them to be, but where they actually are in terms of what they've been taught growing up, what their associations are, beginning from there in introducing a richer understanding of their own faith as well as Judaism. So that is a process at a very junior stage. An interesting example of an effort that I think shows so much promise is Yossi Klein Halevi's book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which now has been covered in numerous Arab countries' media because it was translated into Arabic and is available free online. Obviously, much of the book is about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it addresses political matters and historical narrative. But there's also more than a bit in there about religion, and I think it does a good job on that. But there needs to be much, much more. It's a whole lot easier to find a subsidized copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in an Arab country than to find a translation of Yossi's book.
How is Yossi's book done? What has been the reaction? I'm afraid of this.
Well, it's been covered in Al-Majalla, the Saudi magazine that I showed you. It's been covered in Al-Ahdath al-Maghribiya, which is one of the largest daily newspapers in Morocco. And my understanding is that more coverage is forthcoming, and so far that coverage has been very positive. I'm sure that as the coverage picks up steam, there will be those who have a different perspective and are critical of the book. But that's all part of the process because I would think that the more people who learn about the book, the better, because it will arouse curiosity, and hopefully many of this growing audience will find their way to the Arabic edition online and read it.
Thank you so very, very much. This was marvelous and powerful, inspirational. And my question is in the form of telling you about an incident. The day before I arrived at the conference, I'm driving in my car, listening to what I listen to every day, National Public Radio. And they had a story of a wonderful musician coming out of Palestine. And this music critic, wanted to introduce the Chicago audience to his work. And I'm listening, and it is wonderful music. Then they interview him, and somewhere in the interview he says, this is my vehicle to fight against the occupation. And again, at that point, it kind of sunk my heart. Do we have any bridges to such efforts as well? One, to introduce National Public Radio to your wonderful effort, but also to bridge that, again, his message is important to him. Is there an alternative message that you're suggesting that we can also work on?
So, obviously, thank you for the question. This book is primarily focused on the Arab region beyond the Palestinian areas for a number of reasons, the first of which is that there is such a deep and organic connection between Israel and the broader region, and I share the belief with nearly every, well, I'd say nearly every Mizrahi Jew, certainly, that the right to engage one's ancestral homeland need not be negotiated over, and it is simply an inherent right. The book is treating anti-Semitism with regard to countries, many of which have never fought a war with Israel, and among those that have, those wars are as many as 2 or 3 generations old. And obviously, it is less of an uphill climb to engage the issue of anti-Semitism with communities that have not encountered Israeli force in any way. With respect to Israeli-Palestinian relations, some of the ideas I'm presenting here, while I believe still salient, are nonetheless more wrapped up in the larger challenge of negotiation, overcoming obstacles to negotiation, and reaching a settlement that would enable Palestinians to achieve their legitimate aspirations. But all that said, I think part of the answer to your question is yes. If you look at Mohammed Dajjani, who is a brave voice and certainly a proponent of Palestinians' legitimate rights in every sense, but he believed that it was important to bring Palestinian students to Auschwitz and teach them to view Israelis empathically for every reason. First of all, because it's a moral virtue to be empathic, and second of all, because it's a Palestinian interest to understand the other and to give and take with the other on every level, including the emotional level, and to transcend the fatalism that has understandably been acquired by Israelis with the feeling that there's nobody there who wants to talk to them, everybody rejects them, etc. That is a really uphill climb, and Mohammed Dajjani is brave because he did this and because he confronted and sustained the intense assault on his good name as a result. But yes, there are voices like that. They're inside and out, and we need to encourage them both for the sake of Jewish and Israeli interests and for the sake of Palestinian interests, which require that these trends be encouraged. Yeah.
Do you think there are some countries or communities that are more open to this message? And maybe why that is, like out of the Arab countries?
Well, first of all, there's, as I say, a clear divide between those countries that have never actually had a conflict with Israel in any direct sense, direct, personal, and those that have. But the country which I treat in a chapter, which certainly stands out, is Morocco. First of all, it's a country that had the largest Jewish population of any Arabic-speaking country, 265,000 during the Second World War. It has, of course, a history rife with anti-Semitism, but also marked by remarkable moments of courage, including King Mohammed V's decision to protect and safeguard the rights of the Jewish community during the Vichy occupation of Morocco. Morocco has been engaged with Israel as a security partner quietly for most of the time, and increasingly less quietly, going back to the 1950s and certainly the 1960s. And in the context of those understandings, as well as the enduring and living legacy of Moroccan Jews and their memories of their home, or where they came from, the government has proactively pushed for positive education about the real history of Moroccan Jews and how Judaism is a part of Moroccan heritage and legacy. So you see it in Moroccan schools, you see it in Moroccan broadcasts. It's not an accident that, as Charles mentioned, I'm a broadcaster in Arabic on Moroccan radio. I did it for 7 years, and while I didn't hammer away on the Jewish issue every week, certainly there were occasions that called for bringing it up, and I did so without encountering any interference. Now the same channel has a program called Nas al-Millah. It's a 2-hour program on primetime commuter hours, all about Moroccan Jewish history. There are films, of course you have so many cultural activities that have made a dent. They have made a dent, and they have affected the fabric. King Hassan II, the prior king before Mohammed VI, who now reigns, memorably said that when a Moroccan Jew departs, we don't lose a citizen, we gain an ambassador. And that sentiment, which is part of a larger sense of outreach from the monarchy to its Jewish diaspora, again from their vantage point, is part of why Moroccan Jews' connection has been rekindled over time. It's why there are 30,000 Israeli tourists in Morocco every year, to say nothing of North American, Canadian, and French Moroccan Jews who come to Morocco each year in much larger numbers. It's why you have investors, Moroccan Jews and others, in Morocco. It's why Jews have supported Morocco in its effort, successful, to become the #1 destination for film, for B-team filming in the city of Agadir, and why indeed Morocco was the first Arab country to sign a free trade agreement with the United States, one of many Moroccan initiatives that enjoyed the fulsome and full support of the organized American Jewish community. So it's an excellent relationship, and it shows what I mean by top-down initiatives. And one of the exciting things that you find, and which I provide evidence for in the book, is that in other Arab countries today, you have establishment elites who are saying, let's learn from the Moroccan experience. Let's see how this all played out and what it is about the relationship between Morocco and Jews generally that has been a source of strength for Morocco. And let's explore whether there might be something here worth adopting for the sake of our own national development.
I appreciate this discussion a lot, particularly because I've spent some time studying the power of social media and how anti-Semites and other conservatives use social media and the internet as weapons, tools to spread hate. So I was craving this and I appreciate it. I'm wondering though if there needs to be more aggressive stances, say from organizations like yours or from others, who understand that someone who wants to spread hate can do a lot more harm from their bedroom with a few tweets or posts than I or another team of journalists can do with published reports from newsrooms. it's awesome to see videos like what we just saw, because as a communicator, as a broadcast communicator for years, I understand that with video, when people watch these stories, they remember more of what they feel than what they actually hear. The video you just showed was just of two women who seemed to be, still have a strong connection, although they were separated for many years, but it was that bond that we felt, and there was very little communication in terms of words between them, but it was how it made us feel that I suspect is what made it go viral. So on the other side of that, if there needs to be more aggressive stances and strategies towards putting out things like that online, on social media, to combat the reams and reams and reams of hate that are being put out via Twitter, Facebook, social media, or what have you.
Yeah, great question, thank you. It's clear that some of the largest social media companies were asleep at the wheel for years about this issue. Point of one of so many examples was the fact that Facebook hosted a page during the period of the knifing attacks in Israel called Stab a Jew, that was exhorting people to do exactly that and succeeding. And the Jewish community was unable to get Facebook to take down the page, even though there is a common principle in the US that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, and there are lots of other examples of speech that are not guaranteed by the First Amendment. Now, obviously there's a lot of gray area as well, and it's challenging and problematic to do to other sites what eventually, belatedly happened to the Facebook page Stab a Jew. But there is some indication that social media companies are getting more serious about the issue. And some American organizations have thought carefully about how to not only use laws, but also appeal to families, appeal to companies as part of being good citizens to make their own arrangements and actually voluntarily do these things, not as a result of legal pressure. And that's, of course, part of a larger puzzle. Hopefully, you eliminate a lot of the content that is beyond any semblance of decency or protected speech. And with what's left, you adopt the principle of fighting bad speech with good speech. And again, with respect to Arab countries, I would return to the issue of the top-down component of this, because in the region, however much the popularity of social media is ever growing, a whole lot of people are watching television, and everybody, in the cities at least, of a certain age goes to school, and many go to mosques. And the influence and authority that Arab autocracies have over all of these outlets is vast, and the content is pervasive. It is the single most pervasive source of information. And so, if it were possible, again, this is just a theory, which I've tested on a small scale, I only argue that it's worth piloting and testing on a larger scale. But if it were possible to negotiate systematic reform of those great platforms, that would be another important facet of the effort you and I are talking about. Actually, I'm sorry, I noticed that you've had your hand up, so please.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Definitely. I have a question about representation, actually, in Jewish communities as well. I've been going to a few interfaith conferences, and I have to say that mostly it's Ashkenazi Jews that are at these conferences. And I find that, I'm an Italian Jew, so I do see that as an issue, because then when you have this kind of conversations, I feel that it's often very much more of a diplomatic conversation rather than an emotional one, such as video, something that would spark more of an emotional response. So So I was wondering whether you've seen the same trends, and also if you think there's a way we can engage more Mizrahi Jews to really be a part of that effort. And yeah, thank you so much. It's really great.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yes, it's true. I mean, all the major Jewish organizations are headed by Ashkenazi Jews, and the interfaith initiatives are typically Ashkenazi-led as well. Let me first of all stress that I reject any notion of some kind of a preference or an imprimatur for any ethnic subset of the global Jewish community, and I adopt the view that all Jews are an indigenous Middle Eastern people. That said, I think that the historical marginalization of Mizrahi Jews is unfortunate and represents the failure to utilize a precious resource, particularly in Arab and Islamic ethnic and interfaith outreach, because these stories are so powerful, because Mizrahim have the luxury of the truth in recalling their own deep history, in fact, the oldest history of that region. I mean, my family's history in Iraq goes back more than 2,600 years, and it is the analog to the Copts of Egypt right after the Babylonian exile. So there's nothing to be said, really, in that sense. So I do feel that greater Mizrahi representation in these contexts should be encouraged. How do you get there is probably the subject of another presentation. It surely has to do with the dynamics of American Jewish organizations. It relates to the socioeconomic status of different subsets of the Jewish community and who has the luxury to take time off to do interfaith work or do Jewish community volunteering, etc. And it's a question of culture, right? Do Mizrahi families choose to emphasize this? Do they regard it more fatalistically as something not worth doing? I will say that in my experience, while there is often a lot of cynicism among Mizrahim, it is also very easy to rekindle their enthusiasm by demonstrating that there is a hunger to reconnect with them on the part of Arab publics.
I was wondering, when you were talking about the top-down initiatives or possibilities, you mentioned the creation of a mandate. I'm assuming you mean cooperation with the local government, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that would actually work and also how realistic that is.
So, when I speak of top-down, I've already said in response to the gentleman's question that while establishment-owned, that is, communications outlets owned by either the state or its stalwarts in a given Arab country are the vast majority of content that Arab audiences consume, it is remarkable at this moment in history to observe that all of the major media juggernauts in the Arab world are allies of the United States. Saudi Arabia, largest empire of television and radio and print media and online media from Casablanca to Kuwait City. Qatar, obviously the Al Jazeera juggernaut, which is the most popular news network in many Arab countries and among the most popular in others. The UAE is the major one of the major hubs of Arab media in the Middle East through its Dubai Media City and Abu Dhabi Media City, which host hundreds of channels from most Arab countries. and of course Egypt, which remains a major exporter of entertainment programming across the region. Only a few years ago, before the Arab Spring, Syrian media was still on the map as an important soft power export. But the mass revulsion at the Assad regime, and now at Iran, in light of their mass slaughter of Sunni Syrians, has affected public interest in Syrian media and their Lebanese proxy media and so on, in such a way that it's really a very distant sixth. So 5 US Arab allies dominate the Arab infosphere, and their leaderships are in regular contact with the United States. And yet, very little discussions have happened, serious discussions, between the US and these countries about the granularities of the content that their communications outlets are promulgating. Dennis Ross, remarkable, justly venerated Middle East diplomat, is quoted in this book as saying that the neglect, the failure to adopt a concerted strategic communications strategy alongside diplomatic peacemaking efforts was one of the biggest mistakes we ever made. And so, to come back directly to your question, what I'm arguing is that, first of all, you raise the issue. You raise the issue on the highest levels. But that's happened before. The second point is you offer a turnkey solution. That is, first of all, in a context in which Arab establishment figures are explaining things they want and need that have to do with hard power, that may have to do with economic issues, etc., it might be possible to diplomatically explain what the United States would like, on a list of its own, including addressing the issue of discourse, and to offer a turnkey solution. Say, here is a group of seasoned, bicultural, bilingual media professionals who are ready to, let's just say, swoop, parachute down into your major channels and so on, and offer a system of training, offer foundational content of a different sort, and offer a monitoring and accountability mechanism to ensure that whatever commitments you make are met. And given the successful completion of certain markers, we would indeed love to do this other thing that you are asking us for. I mean, we live in a world in which, you've heard, I'm sure, a great deal about Arab and other countries' efforts to engage American public opinion. We live in an interconnected world, and obviously that is a way of dismissing the argument, but in the end, in a context of discussion of interests, I think that it's possible to look more favorably and openly. Some Arab leaders have acknowledged the problem of incitement. So it's not even an idea that is coming from outside. And more importantly, it is vital to Arab national interests to address this problem. Anti-Semitism is a force against human development. It has had a destructive legacy. It is part of the reason that the region is awash in bloodshed, because the same anti-Semitic intellectual technologies are now being employed in internal ethnic and sectarian politics. So you're serving the Arab world by raising this issue and getting to the root of it.
Sorry, just kind of piggyback off Richard's question here. So if the mandate wasn't, if you weren't doing like infiltration, right, it's not like one-sided, like, oh, hey, since we're allies and you depend on us for X, Y, Z, we really like you do this. It was more like a bartering thing, where it's a give and take. What sort of talking about the Saudis, like, you know, as you well know, like, the media is like it's an insanely complex and, you know, huge system. And so talking about like significantly reforming that, I feel like the concessions we might have to make may be actually like worse off for future like, peace. Your thoughts?
Well, the specific issues of different countries' wish lists and so on is, of course, a fluid set of issues. They change over time, etc. So it's not something that I'm representing in any detail today. But I would like to say that what I'm saying is that the US and other allies of establishment powers in the region need to adopt communications reform as a major strategic priority. If you bump it up on the list, if you recognize the obvious fact that there is no peace between nations without a peace between peoples, a real peace, then you go after it as you might go after any other vital regional interest. To come back to the issue of the question of who has the right to raise this issue, I'd like to tell you that this idea does not come from me. It comes from Arab actors all over the region whom I work with, who have been telling me, Joseph, why don't Americans get this? If only we knew your leaderships and knew your language, we would be begging them to do this. In other words, the demand that I'm talking about is an indigenous one. I am simply representing to you what a larger number of Arab actors are praying for. And so it's not even an American demand. To the contrary, as Dennis pointed out in his quote, the US hasn't been going after this. This is a demand that is coming from within the region, and the US, as it often aspires to do, in being in tune with positive trends within the region, should join those actors who are pressing for this. I think I have very little time left, but I'll try to give you a quick answer.
Yeah, just a quick question. I think with CW, Children's Television Network, has done a lot of work in terms of actually individual countries have individual versions of Sesame Street. A friend of mine was involved. Familiar with that?
Yes, I am familiar. I know that they're very active in the Arab world. And in a moment, I'll say that it is one of a much larger number now of Western media institutions that are creating Arabic content. You have National Geographic Arabic. You have Sky News Arabia, which is a joint venture with Abu Dhabi, and many others. CNN Arabia, there's a Bloomberg project that was in the works, is now a little stalled. These institutions can do a lot more on this issue than they are actually doing. That would be my general observation. And so the message I'm sharing with you today, the book refers to those institutions as well, and the fact that there's much more that they can do.
This will be the final question.
Yes, this is really quick. I was struck by one of the interviews that you did when you ended off with the song in Spanish and a little bit of Hebrew, and I just wanted to know if I could get your thoughts really quickly on the idea of creativity as far as visioning and implementing reconciliation.
Well, you saw two instances of music and poetry that was meant to encourage a feeling of potential for reconciliation. And you saw one example of war poetry at the beginning of this talk, which was inciting hate and violence. But I think that creativity and the arts have a crucial role to play. I mentioned Yossi Klein Halevi's book earlier. He had a lovely interview in a video that's now online, in which he said that if there's ever going to be peace, it's going to be made by people who love stories. people who know how to tell stories, real stories, and people who know how to listen to each other's stories. So I have to head out, and perhaps we consider continue the conversation, but the bottom line is I completely agree with you that creative, out-of-the-box communications approaches are vital to getting something new, creating a new sense of momentum in the right direction.